talking about the last thing that we were talking about was this concept of our sensory apparatus. I mean, this is so important because I've been trying to think about this, how the sensory relates to the intuition. Because I've heard when I go to the Hare Krishna place, the guy's talking about the sensory apparatus and intuition. And you see, the things that my grandpa talks about, they don't just come out of nowhere. Because I go to these different places, I go to a Hare Krishna temple, and the guy's mentioning the same words, but they're trying. But he's trying to understand this whole concept. But the thing is, my grandpa has been articulating it in a more fascinating way. But he's doing the same type of thing, talking about senses versus intuition, and sensory apparatus. And he was talking about how the sensory apparatus doesn't see what really is. Your sensory apparatus is only, we know that as a fact. Your senses are only seeing within the visible spectrum of electromagnetic waves. That's visible light. And we think that right now that table is brown, but really that's just because an electromagnetic wave of brown is coming back into our eye, and we're sensing that because it's actually absorbing all the other lights. And so, like, what we think is there is not what is really there. And really there's actually ultraviolet lights that we don't even have any capacity to sense at all. And all these different things. But my grandpa's talking about something different, but I'm just getting at the concept that they're talking about, that the Hare Krishna place, about the sensories and the intuition and how the relationship between them. But he didn't quite understand, I don't think, what he was talking about. But he was trying to mention these relationships, and he was trying to say that intuition might come from past lives. And you're in your past life, and in this life, your genetic memory is in your DNA, and it gets sent to the next life, and this is where your intuition comes from. This is what he was trying to say, and he was trying to relate these concepts. But what are you talking about, Grab, about how we're negotiating and navigating within the world of and the relationship with the sensory apparatus and everything?
This is pretty heavy stuff, but it seems quite clear that on the human level, there is there's the sensory apparatus, which has a capacity that's magnificent in its accomplishments, but it's limited because we, in addition to our sensory apparatus that enables us to contact the world around us, we have a more transcendent capacity, which we've named intuition and inspiration, which has the capacity to discern or become aware of a dimension of reality that's that transcends the physical and the interpersonal. So, so we can settle for just negotiating, using our five senses to negotiate within the world that our senses perceive as physical and interpersonal. And we can settle for that. That's what the Game of Thrones is saying is what occurs inside the wall. But that there's another whole dimension of reality that we can uh, begin to discern the presence of, the reality that it exists. We have a capacity for that, which we call the intuitive and inspiration capability. And that goes beyond our sensory apparatus. And and until we reawaken, see, maybe children had that capacity. We don't know, but some suspect that children have that intuitive and inspired capacity. But because they're born into a world where the consensus reality is that it's a physical interpersonal world, and the only thing we have to deal with that are our five senses, it, they end up just relying on that exclusively to the neglect of the development of the intuitive and the inspiration capabilities. And it's only later in life when we begin to be confronted with the problems that result from limiting our life to just living within that spectrum that physical interpersonal spectrum. Until we begin to experience the pain and the limitations of that, we don't start uh, reawakening and then developing our intuitive and inspired capabilities.
So hopefully we're going to return to this idea of intuition and how we move up these levels to intuition. And you had this definition for inspiration about the accumulation of so and so achieves the synergy, which brings about inspiration. But we'll talk about that definition later. But I remember you're talking about the idea that too, that the physical world, there is no physical world, because even this table right here, it's really made up of like 0.0001% matter. Everything else is empty space. But somehow sensory apparatus and everything, we're negotiating within this. We're participating within this world of.
Yeah, our sensory apparatus doesn't have the capability of discerning the spaces, both in or the emptiness in both space and time between these energy events, which we call atoms and quarks. See, all they can't. Our senses are not capable of discerning that empty space. Our senses are just. It's like it's like using your eyes rather than a telescope to look out into the universe. Our eyes just aren't capable of of um, of seeing that far. And likewise, our eyes are not, our sensory apparatus is not capable of seeing that emptiness in both space and time between the energy events we call atoms and quarks, etc.
So what does this mean? What's the significance of this fact that we're not seeing the fact that there's empty space mainly here, but I touch it and I feel the empty space, but there really is really basically no matter here, but it seems like there is in my senses.
Yeah, because your senses can only sense, uh, cannot sense the spaces. They can only sense what appears to be solid.
So I remember you would talk about that you sat on a plane one time and your legs were up like this, and then you suddenly got kind of frightened because you were thinking that you might fall through.
Yeah.
Can you explain that, Grandpa?
Well, that was just simply a momentary awareness that this was not a solid object. This was essentially space. Both my feet and the chair or the table were empty space, and that if I were in total alignment, my feet could fall through it. Just like, so the story goes, Jesus was able to walk through walls
Or walk on water.
or walk on water.
So and then you had this idea that maybe he could even float, that he could travel up on top of the building instead of So we'll get back to this idea, and get back to it in terms of the burning bush as well. But first, before we do that, let's talk about the idea of inspiration. So we were talking about moving up the levels, and you were talking about waking up. So there's growing up, which is going up those different levels of duality, superior, inferior, up to mutual participation and stuff. Then we're talking about waking up. What are the levels of waking up, and can you define inspiration and intuition? You had those definitions and everything.
Yeah, I don't remember the definitions I used, but the hierarchy of waking up, I've articulated as um, magical thinking. It's looking at the world as being operated by a magician. So that's magical thinking. And many religions settle for just magical thinking. But most religions go to the next level, which is what I call superstition thinking. That's at one step in waking up. And that is where there's not a magician that operates autonomously, but this magician can be influenced. And that's superstition thinking. They have the superstition that you can influence this magician. That's at least one step in waking up. The next step is ritualistic thinking or ritualistic participation, where you begin to understand that if we follow certain procedures, if we follow in certain ways of behavior ritualistically, that can get us closer to aligning with the flow. We don't understand it, but at least we're willing uh, to obey if I don't eat this, or if I do eat this, if I worship every time, if I go through these rituals, at least I am aligning myself to the possibility of being in the flow. Things go better when I align myself according to certain um, prescriptions. The next level is mythological thinking, and that is I don't really understand it and I can't explain it, but I can illustrate it. So that's what myths are all about. Myths are using um, experiences that we've had in life and using that as a way of, of illustrating somewhat poetically my understanding of truth or of reality. So we've developed myths that help us to get an impression of what it means to understand the flow, understand the presence of the presence of God, however you want to call it. And then after mythological, then comes intellectual. So we begin to then explain how everything works,
It's rational.
rational. And then we begin to see the limitations of that, and we move to intuitive. And see, here's where it becomes increasingly more difficult for me, and I suspect for everyone, to explain or articulate or make logical definitions. Intuitive, some have said, is coming to know what we didn't know we already knew. In other words, it's a dawning awareness that we are wiser than we understand. We are no we we are wiser than we can appreciate, than we can be aware of. There is a wisdom operative or operating in our lives that's beyond our, our comprehension, and that's intuition. It's coming to know, coming to an awareness of things that we didn't know we already knew. That was already there, already inherent in us, in our in who we are. And then inspired thinking, see, that goes beyond. I really don't have an explanation for inspired thinking, but it's just it's it's like, again, my favorite passage of the Mount of Transfiguration. They had an inspired realization of reality at that moment. That reality was not the man Jesus and the man Peter and James and John or whoever it was. The reality was not the mountain. The reality was the light. And that's what they saw. That's what they were aware of. Same way with Moses in the burning bush. He had an inspired realization that this was not a physical bush. This was corks firing. These were energy events firing and not consuming the bush.
What does that mean? Firing and not consuming?
Well, it was just what was happening was these energy events exploding. See, that's what a quark is. It's an energy event flashing on and off, and that's what he became aware of. This is just an energy. This is an expression of the flow. This is an expression of light. This is an expression of life, of love, however you want to call it. That was his inspired moment. And see, these don't come to the unprepared, but they don't come by preparing for them. You can't make them happen, but they won't happen without trying to make them happen.
They won't come to the unprepared. What was it you said?
Yeah, they won't come to the unprepared, but you can't prepare for them to happen. You can only prepare yourself and then be surprised.
So you talk about like they're anticipated accidents. It's a paradox. They're expected surprises.
Yeah.
They're anticipated because you did prepare for them, right? You developed yourself and
you prepared for the possibility of them happening.
How did Moses prepare for that possibility?
Well, see, he apparently spent a lot of time alone out on the mountainside. See, he was out tending his father's sheep. And when you're tending the sheep, The sheep are just out there eating. They don't need you. You have a lot of time for contemplating, for meditating. You spend a lot in contemplative meditation.
But how's he gonna get to that level? Doesn't he also need a Sherpa to get him to that
Well,
level?
he must have had somehow. He must have had some kind of a exposure.
Maybe
to
growing up in
Sherpa.
the Egyptian household, he probably was
Yeah.
like given a lot of magical priestly
Yeah.
uh, teachings and stuff.
Yeah. Well, see, some people would say his preparation was in a former life. We don't know.
Well, also the fact maybe too because he lived in the Egyptian household, but he was an Israelite, and also so basically this is already unsettling him and giving him a little bit of discomfort, and the fact that he has to even run away from his home and live with the so he's constantly he's forced to try to look beyond the box or see
Yeah.
greater things because he cannot settle in he knows that he cannot settle in one paradigm.
Right. He was forced into an expanding of his awareness.
But then when he comes back, did it become a prescription? Did it become a box, a booth, or
Well, perhaps it didn't for him, but when he probably tried to explain it to people and they turned it into content and put it in a container and made a religion out of it.
so okay? So we're talking about intuition. Did we get to inspiration yet?
That's what we were just talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I remember you gave like a definition of inspiration that it's when you have an accumulation of enough material and stuff, then it comes together in the patterns that produce. It's not like the idea of emergence too. Remember you talked about emergence.
Yeah.
And what are these ideas?
Well, see, it's that whole idea that this or theory that everything is the realized potential in the synergy that emerges from the creative interplay of its constituent parts. Did you follow that? So everything, say when you're playing music, those what we what we call those chicken skin moments when suddenly you have this transcendent awareness of beauty and perfection. That is the realized potential in the synergy that emerges from this creative interplay, not only of the musicians and the conductor, but of the audience also. And out of that creative interplay and that attentive responsiveness, something emerges out of that. So that maybe everything is everything. An atom is the realized potential in the synergy emerging from the creative interplay of its. And a molecule is the same. It's the realized potential. See, when atoms are creatively interplaying, they're developing a potential for something. They don't know what it is, but they're developing a potential, and a molecule is then the realized potential in the synergy that emerges as a result of the creative interplay of the atoms.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way with we as human beings, we are not human beings. We are the realized potential in the creative interplay and in this synergy emerging from the creative interplay of all of our quarks, our atoms, our cells, our organs, etc.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a creative interplay of us to create whatever's beyond it, or what?
Yes, exactly. So that what's happening beyond life is the realized potential in the synergy that's emerging from the creative interplay of all of the creative activity of human beings and the world.
Yeah, that's that. All
No.
right, let's hopefully